Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Checked In Podcast. Got Michael and Zach here with resident stoner Danny B, the almost third face of the podcast here. We got an episode filled with extraterrestrial, conspiracy, you name it, and we're going to jump into a video right now.
We just out here. We're chilling. We're out here chilling. I hear it. I hear him. Where's she at? What the fuck is that noise, bro? What is that noise? Where are you? This is crazy. I heard it. I hear it. Oh my God.
Bruh.
That's crazy.
So,
Yo.
for everybody who doesn't know about that video, who hasn't seen that video is basically the beginning of a bunch of videos that he posted about the existence of mermaids. He's basically saying that video, the screams you hear in that video, the noise you're hearing in that video is a mermaid screaming for whatever reason. And then he follows that up with videos. The government comes to the ship and checks the ship out. His car got wrecked like a week or two after the video was posted. And Zach actually found this video and sent it to us. And Danny, what do you think about that video?
It's pretty interesting. I mean, the title alone, Sirens, catches my attention right away. Being a big history guy, big into like fantasy realms and stuff like that too. I like to study mythologies a lot. Yeah. And the siren, it comes to very, very old tales and stuff stems from generally ancient Greece, is from my knowledge of that. And they were pretty much like mermaids, but they were able to fly too, some of them. Some Greek tales talk about them being in the water. Some majority, though, of them talk about them being in like the hills and stuff like that. But they would use their screams and stuff like that to lure men in. And then that's when they would take them under the water to drown them, like mermaids would do. Or in the land, certain places, they would take them in like caves and stuff like that and do their bidding with men. So that's where that comes from. So hearing that, it makes the hair on your arm stand up just a little bit. I'm not gonna lie. Because of like all the reports you hear about of mermaids, things like that. They even did that documentary series a while back, showing like mermaids going all the way back to ancient history up until modern times. So while you don't get to see much in that video, you really couldn't hear much when it was being shared. But watching the video and you actually hear that in the background, and like my hair stood up my arms the first time I heard it. I'm still a little skeptical about it, not gonna lie, but it's a little weird. His car crashed afterwards, and regardless of how skeptical I was, the hair on my arm still stood up from it. Yeah, and that usually said something. That's human instinct, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I didn't know about them being out of the water. I thought it was just in the water.
Yeah, I didn't know about that either.
Yeah, that goes back to the really old tales in Greece and stuff like that. They talk about those kind of things. And again, like the definition of siren, it changes based on culture too. So it like where you grew up and the stories you heard, it's like the telephone game. You hear the story 300 times and it gets passed down, things get changed.
Like
and
religion.
People change the story to match where they live. So that's where you're going to get stuff like that.
Like religion.
Yeah. Pretty much. The product of your environment is what it boils down to, you know?
Yeah. Word. Yeah. I don't know. I think my take on that is pretty crazy because the other two videos after that, there's like literally they like know his shit. And I guess the backstory for that video is I guess the US dropped a 40-ton like nuke into the water like I don't know, some miles away from the Florida Keys, pretty much in the Bermuda Triangle, where there's led to believe that there's a whole bunch of mysticism and like all this other stuff down there. Some people believe it's the portal to the hollow earth and like all that other shit. So it's crazy because like I was like, yo, because there's the other two videos that he posted. There's one where there's a legit mermaid leg in the water.
Really?
And the other,
Yeah, I heard about that.
and then then the other one, he throws like a crab off ship, and then the crab flies back in after he walks past where he threw it in, flies back in, lands on the ship behind him, and he's like, "What the fuck? No, what threw this back in?" And then the last video, it's two, like, okay, I don't think dolphins could swim that fast, but it's just two things swimming in the water, like following the ship parallel to the ship, like on the same side, like left and right. And his whole crew is out on the ship at that time. They all see it. So yeah, there's something in Florida, in the Floridian waters, and that where they're wherever they're fishing at, bro. Like,
Yeah.
and it's really crazy too, because only 5% of every ocean has actually been discovered or been explored or whatever. The other 5 is deemed unexplorable because we just don't have technology and people can't go that deep. So it's just like we only know 5% of the 75% of the water that's on Earth.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
we know more about space. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's crazy. And speaking of space, I think that's also a great place for extraterrestrials to hide. If there are extraterrestrials, maybe they're just people from deep underwater.
No,
And
absolutely.
they'll always hear that the extraterrestrials are talking to people or kids mostly about environmental awareness. Is like the number one message that's always gets passed down to each generation has encountered aliens and stuff like that. So I think, like, honestly, it could be because, like, why would an alien that doesn't live here care about the environment of people unless they have some type of entitlement or relationship with Earth in some way? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so I think, like, I think either there's just aliens and stuff underwater we don't know about, or there's just like just stuff underwater. And then if you want to speak on the hollow Earth theory, there's probably a fuck ton of shit underneath the water, underneath the Earth.
I could go for 6 days on stuff like that if you really want to.
But
We'll keep this short for your purposes
please
here.
do.
Yeah, we'll get there.
I definitely thought it was weird though when you brought up in past episodes, Zach, that the aliens have some type of, like, when the aliens come, it's all like, we need to preserve the Earth. It's never on some like malicious anything, right? It's always like, we need to preserve the Earth. I know I've had conversations with Danny about how, like, aliens came to, I believe it was Africa, because of gold, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, if you look into some of the ancient like tablets and stuff we've recovered, most of which that we now know as like the Sumerian tablets and things like that, it stems from like the legends of the Anunnaki. And if you listen to Zachariah Sitchin, which was one of the guys who translated the tablets, he's one of a handful of people who was able to. His translations, which were the most broad of all of them, pretty much broke down the whole story of it and how this group of people came from another planet, planet X, or one of the other planets in our solar system that has a different type of path around the solar system than we do around our sun, which happens like every 3,000 some odd years. It comes back through. And when they came here, they said they came to mine gold because their planet, their atmosphere was dwindling. And in order to maintain their atmosphere, they needed to throw gold up into the atmosphere, like particles of gold, pretty much. Yeah. And while that seems crazy at the time when he was translating all of this, like what we now know from modern times and NASA is like our astronauts, they have gold-plated face shields and things like that. And gold, it bounces off the radiation, protects people basically. So it now all comes together and makes a little bit more sense. So yeah, they came here mining gold. They took the tribal people that was living on the planet at the time, which was us before what we call either the missing link or whatever you would like. Basically the part where science can't explain what happened to us and religion can't explain what happened to us. It's that missing part where if it basically, once you figure out that part, it can combine both and we can figure out probably what happened.
Absolutely.
And according to Zachariah Sitchin, that was they messed with our DNA. They literally came down, took what was pre-human and messed with its DNA a little bit and created us, what we now know as modern human. And we were basically a slave race is what he boils it down to.
So it was, so they altered our DNA to basically be able to mine for the gold, kind of like consciously be able to actually take direction and do this thing. That's why they altered our DNA.
They did it because they were basically lazy, according to the translations. They didn't want to do the work themselves. There was only a couple hundred of them, and there were thousands and thousands and thousands of us. So what do you do? Like, what would humans do nowadays? You know, if we were to get into a spaceship right now with Jeff Bezos and his flying metal, you know what, and fly off to another planet, and we got there, and there were a bunch of people living in caves, and we showed up, and they were like, oh my gosh, who are they? Must be gods. They showed up in flying ships. They have medicines. They know things we don't know, and they can help us. But little do they know behind the scenes, what would we do? You know, like, look at what we're, us as America are doing overseas right now.
Yeah, exactly.
We basically go to the other countries and we take their resources and natural resources, and then we up and screw out of there once we've had enough of it, and we leave them to fend for themselves.
Yeah,
and that's where like the ancient astronaut theory comes into play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember you telling me a story. You telling me that. And I didn't really, this was like when we first met, I wasn't really into all the stuff that you were talking about. And then you actually brought up the story of the U.S. Air Force pilots that were, I think it was World War II, was it?
Correct.
And they landed on an island where it was just the indigenous people of the island. It was a very basic knowledge of just whatever was around them. They didn't have the modern medicine, none of that stuff.
They've never even seen white person before. They've never even seen white person. So we showed up. Yeah.
And then they went there, they saw those people, and then they left, came back with medicine, technology, ways to grow crops, all of this stuff. And then when the island was visited again, like, what was it, 10, 20 years later?
It was in the 70s, late 70s. I want to say 76. I'd have to look it up a little again, but it was in the late 70s. It was a British researcher that went back.
Yeah. And they ended up having, what was it? A shrine, right? They had a shrine on the landing strip, and the religion of the island was now towards these two white men who landed on the island and gave them medicine and all that stuff. And I just found out recently too, there's a holiday in that island, actually celebrates a holiday for when they landed on the island.
Correct. And all it was Americans with a little bit better technology. But you have to view it from their viewpoint. They've never seen white people. They are literally in loincloths. Their doctors were shamans. If they couldn't heal you with the plants that were on that island and the resources given to them on that island from what they knew, you basically died of something that we would consider the common cold or something like that, could kill someone like that on an island.
Right.
And then out of the sky one day comes these loud noises, and these metal birds fall from the sky, land on their island. They come out. They are of light white skin, which they've never seen before. And they're speaking in a tongue they've never heard before. And they see people who are dying of these illnesses and give them things which we now know as just antibiotics.
Right.
We give that to a culture who is using roots to heal people. And all of a sudden, we're gods to them.
Yeah.
We're doing something they haven't been able to do for thousands and thousands of years in their culture. Right. And because of that, they view us as gods. We're helping them out. We're teaching them new things. Hey, instead of doing this with your crops, try this, and their crops would grow better. And then we only did that because we needed their little island as an Air Force base. It was just a runway to help us attack Japan easier. And we spread them across the Pacific all over the place. This probably happened numerous times. This is just one sample size. So yeah, when the war ended and we just up and left them, they were back to nothing, not knowing how to make penicillin, not knowing how to make an airplane, not knowing what the heck just happened to them.
Right. And
when this British researcher came back to the island, when he arrived on the island and stepped foot off of his helicopter or boat or however he got there, they all fell to their knees and started bowing to him. And their shamans came out, and their shamans were wearing, instead of masks of their old gods, were wearing masks that were the shape of American US fighter pilot helmets.
Wow.
Exactly. And their literal whole religion changed based off of not knowing what happened to them. And they described the event as the gods have come back in their metal birds and things like that. They say birds and stuff. And you can even move this to like religion, where angels and divine beings with wings and stuff. It doesn't necessarily mean they had literal bird wings coming out of their backs. It was just their way of saying they had the ability of flight, because they didn't have that word. They didn't have spaceship back in ancient times in India when like the gods came down from the skies and stuff like that. They came down on turtles and birds, and that's why in like Iran and Syria and stuff like that, their ancient religions all show their gods as being in the sky in circles with wings coming off of the circles. That's their actual logo for the religion of Zoroastrianism, I believe it's called, which is where Islam comes from. And yeah, so that was their way. It didn't mean that they were come down in birds. It was just like these people came from the sky and we didn't know how to describe it. The only thing that we know that flies is a bird. So that's what we describe this. So,
oh wow, okay.
Yeah, it all connects when you start pulling the strings to it. And it's a rabbit hole sometimes. And it's very easy to get lost in conspiracy on it. And it's very hard to maintain as like someone who loves history to keep it factual and to take the myth and try to combine the two. And it's the same way with like science and religion with me. I'm torn on each one, you know, like I'm so historical and scientific, but at the same sense, being scientific, you can't prove something 110%. In my mind, I'm so OCD that I have to fall down that rabbit hole to figure out like what is going on. Is it this? Is it this? Is it something in the middle? It's that old saying, you know, there's two sides to every story. If there's an argument between two friends, you want to believe both. And in actuality, both are right and both are wrong.
Exactly.
And you gotta find that middle common ground. And that's where I've spent like majority of my nights, you know, hanging at home and just researching things and trying to figure out what's BS and what isn't and trying to put it all together.
Right. And what's crazy too with the ancient civilizations, I've seen recently that there's actually like jewelry and little like trinkets that they made that were the same shape. And like what we know today is like spaceships. They had those, like they found those in ancient, like near the temples and all of that. And they've
in South America. I know exactly what you're talking about. It was in Belize, I believe.
Yes.
Okay.
They're little like figures about this big, about shaped
right
like
outside of Mexico, right?
Correct. Yep.
Now, do you think that those same trinkets, going back to the underwater civilizations, mermaids and all of that, first of all, are those underwater civilizations, have they always been underwater, or were they at one point above ground? Or above
at one point they were all above ground. The Earth, what we know now, looked nothing like it does now back then, like at all. Yes, like places like the Gobi Desert and the Sahara Desert, they were both actual rainforests and jungles, and now they're deserts with nothing grows.
We talked about that before. I think it was like 2 or 3 episodes ago, and there's glass on the desert floor.
Absolutely.
And from like the glass comes from like a nuclear reaction.
Correct. Because it can only be formed with a certain heat, which would have been nuclear reaction. Yes.
Yeah.
This is where it all ties into ancient theory of you can call it Atlantis, Lemuria, Hyperborea. There's places underwater. There's Hollow Earth. All these different civilizations talk about a precursor to what we now know as us, modern man. And the Mayans talked about it with their cycles and going through all of that. The Earth changes and destroys itself and rebirths itself in cycles. And it gets to a point where civilizations grow and collapse and grow and collapse. And we look at that as a small scale. Like when you hear about civilizations growing and collapsing, your first thought is usually like the Roman Empire. Yeah. Like that's on a small scale. I'm going back.
They're still in power.
It never left. It never left. That's a whole nother podcast. But yes, the underwater civilizations, I think, have always been there because once they were above land, and those were focal points where these aliens maybe that are coming to visit Earth and stuff, they may have not have a connection with us. And now they're trying to just figure out us. And that's why they seem like they're at a distance. Because maybe that connection they have with this planet was with the ones who came before. They were with the Atlanteans, the Lemurians, the Hyperboreans, the Greek gods, the Norse gods, the Hindu ones. All those divine beings with crazy powers and stuff that could literally be attributed to, like I mentioned earlier, a technology we just didn't understand. Right. And that's where remnants of that ancient past is the pyramids. And like, how do pyramids in the Mayan Empire and in Egypt and in Cambodia all bear such similarities, but be so far
in Mexico
apart? And in Mexico. And I
Yeah.
mean, in the Grand Canyon, they have found ancient Egyptian artifacts. So
Wow.
yes, this is, you can look it up. The Smithsonian came and took those ancient Egyptian artifacts and just took them away.
In the Grand Canyon?
In the Grand, there's news articles that date back to either the early 1900s or the late 1800s of an explorer in the Grand Canyon who found a little cave, and he went into that cave, and in there he found a bunch of relics that were all Egyptian, hieroglyphs that were Egyptian, mummifications that were Egyptian. He came back, reported the location to the local news. They did a news article about it, and kind of just like Roswell, there was a news article. Then the next day, you didn't hear a thing about it. And the Smithsonian came. No one's found the cave ever since, but there is a news article based off of that. And I mean, we all know the Smithsonian.
There's a lot of shit in the West, bro. The Area 51, this cave.
There's so many stories about all sorts of that stuff. And it all ties back to an ancient forgotten past. Yeah. So these underwater civilizations that you hear of, or these aliens that, or you even hear of UFOs coming out of the water. In World War II, Operation Paperclip, when the United States, after World War II, was figuring out that Germany was going to Argentina, and from Argentina, maybe down to the Antarctica, and from there creating hidden bases. We thought of it as hogwash at first until we started capturing more and more German officers and U-boats, and they were all going to the same place. Well, we amassed an army. We went down there under General Byrd or Admiral Byrd. And when
we talked about that before.
They got obliterated within 2 days. And he came back and told the story of what he found down there. And he says that these flying saucers, or as they called them, Foo Fighters in the World War II, were coming out of the water and shooting out of the water, attacking, going back into the water, back up into the air and stuff like that. And I mean, it could be Nazi, it could be alien, and those aliens could have been going to these places underwater and looking for the past civilizations and cities that were once there. Yeah. Or Atlantis, same kind of thing, you know, that they could be going to visit the place that they once had that connection with.
Right. Yeah, there's like villages in Antarctica that are like under the ice or almost completely covered in ice, and like they only could see like certain parts. But it's crazy because it's crazy because we talked about this in our first episode, and we realized that Germany was there, I think, for a year, and then America was there for like 2 years after that. Or no, my bad. It was the other way around. Germany was there from like 38 to I think 44, 45, 1938 to 34. Or basically throughout the whole World War, they were there.
Yeah. And
it was crazy because we were like, yo, when they first got there, they seen like structures in the mountains, and like there was like some form of civilization. And then like later, years and years later, they realized like there's thousands and thousands and thousands of feet of ice, and then under that is like lakes and all that stuff. So it looks like Antarctica at one point in time at least was actually inhabitable, and probably still is inhabitable. They just can't go down there because of what you just said. Like there's a whole bunch of there's a defense system set up down there for
something doesn't want us to find what's there. Exactly.
And no country can now claim it. Like no country can claim Antarctica. Normally you just fight over it, and then
world leaders have meetings there. And it's why and who are we meeting? What are we meeting with? And
the Space Force is actually something that came up during the Trump administration. Vice President, I forget his name, Pence. He's been like the pretty much the front runner of the Space Force. I think he renamed the launch center in Houston as the Space Force Center for the base. I forgot what the name of the base was there, but he renamed the base there to the Space Force. So like, and then earlier this year in June, all the world governments are starting to now release classified information about space and extraterrestrial beings, and confirming that there are aliens from outer space and all that other stuff.
Ready for the release, correct?
So
it's a major transition because there's so many different types of people in the world that aren't ready to hear information like that yet.
And I think it's like something that everybody already knew. So I feel like they should just jump the gun and just be like, press conference, override every single show on Viacom, and just be like, this is the aliens. Like, this is who they are. They've been here for years and years and years. and they're good to us for the most part. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think I've heard any like bad things other than abductions, but people that have came back from abductions have testified that it wasn't like a bad experience. It was just like uh you know one person, I believe,
Yeah.
yeah, it was scary because they didn't know what was going on, but one person, I believe, felt like he couldn't uh there was like a lot of pressure. He said like basically he experienced that he left our atmosphere because he felt the force
Mm-hmm.
of like leaving, like the G force or whatever it is. And then he said they never talked to him, but they were like he would hear thoughts, and like he would feel certain emotions that they
Telepathy.
were, yeah, telepathy pretty much. Yeah, they're speaking to him with telepathy. So it's not like it's like a direct conversation, but it's just like he's speaking to them and they're like just staring at him, and he's feeling emotions and like all this other stuff. And I think
Yeah.
he was under so much like stuff that he was actually becoming sick, and then that like actually made them return him back to Earth. Um, and I don't know the guy's name because I was reading a document online about it. But I think this happened because the guy was Australian. I think this happened in like the 50s. So this is like right post War II, like right before the Cold War type thing. And I think he was either from New Zealand or Australia. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's the same spot, but
Mhm.
or the same country. I don't know if they're like two separate governments or whatever. But yeah, he was from there, and I mean that's like some far out island area, like pretty secluded, um, which has me believe that the sunken continent of Mu, which is
Yeah.
between the Pacific Ocean, is between the two continents, America and Asia. And that, I mean, they've seen a lot of the similar things of our, similar architecture underwater. That there's villages and stuff like that. Like they had very advanced technology, or at least
Right.
advanced for that time frame. Um, and some of it's so far down, like they can't go, and they can only take pictures of things, but they seem like there was like the way the cities were, everything was in circles, right? So like their city walls were in circles, and then it was like within, it looked like a mini coliseums all over the place, right? And it kind of reminded them like ancient Rome, ancient Greece.
Yeah.
um and I
That
believe
Hellenistic culture.
the
Yeah.
yeah, there was like huge head sculptures like of whoever their leaders were, but like I don't think they're able to recover any documents from anything, or like tablets or anything like that with writing on it. But it's just crazy to see that stuff like that is like just sitting underwater. Um, and like you said, maybe on that 3,000 year cycle to return, like maybe that's something that they were looking for, and that's why their ships are so constantly going underwater and can go at all these different rates. I mean, and if you think about it like this, like there's like the giant squid, but then the squid is only at a certain depth, and then there's other shit under the depths that we don't even know. Not only that, I've just recently heard from another source that I have that in Russia they drilled like a 7 or 8 mile, no, they drilled a 9 mile hole in the ground, and they didn't touch any water, right? So that just leads me to believe that the ocean that they say is only 7 miles deep at its deepest discovered point is deeper than that. Because if there's no water 9 miles under the water, below sea level, like there's no way that there's no water underneath the 7 mile drop. So then that also leads me to believe like, hey, what's really under there? And it's so dark. You know what I mean? We can't see. There's underwater lakes and caverns and like, rivers underwater that have their own currents and behave and act like that, act like actual rivers and stuff like that. So it's like, what else can there be? One, other earthling things like organization my bad, organizations or organisms, right? And
Mhm.
then other than that, I mean, those are perfect hiding places for
Absolutely.
anything. I mean, anything extraterrestrial or not.
Mhm.
Then not only that, there's also caves and other stuff that have their own ecosystems underwater, where like you can go underwater. There's a pocket of air underneath the cave, underneath the water. You pop in the cavern, and in the cavern, it's its own
There's
everything, which is
yeah.
what the Hollow Earth theory kind of stems from.
Yeah, there's
So it's
caves
just
with
like this.
literal own ecosystems inside of them where it has its own weather patterns inside of caves, where it can rain inside of caves.
Yeah.
It's
And
crazy.
yeah, I think that's crazy how it's
On my
rain,
mind,
but no.
literally all podcasts. All podcasts. I'm just my mind is blown.
But rain without the sun coming in to like evaporate it. That's what I want to know. Like,
yeah, that again, I am not smart enough to speak on any of that kind of stuff. When it comes to, like,
I'm
the
not
science
either.
behind
But
any of it. I just
yeah,
know like there are places where that can create its own rain. And if you make that on a massive scale, imagine what you could have under there. Like I was talking
yeah.
earlier, Admiral Byrd actually in one of his stories when he was during Operation Paperclip was doing a reconnaissance flight on an airplane, and he went through the curvature of the Earth into hollow Earth. And he went that way. So basically what he states is that the curvature happens ever so slight that when you're on an airplane, you can't even tell that you're going like that and then underneath the earth and then going around. To you as a pilot, it would feel like you are just flying straight. And when he went underneath there was its own world where he reported such things as mastodons and an ancient civilization that was living under the earth and stuff like that. And when he came back, he was literally thrown in jail and called a kook and locked up in a mental insane asylum, basically. Naturally, of course.
Typically, yeah, that's what they
you
do.
take this back in history, the people that live in Mexico and Central America, all the way up until like New Mexico, Arizona, Texas areas, all those ancient civilizations that live there, they talk about people called the ant people. And when they draw them on their caves, they look like what we call alien grays, where the big almond head, the big almond eyes, the little tiny mouth, and the slit for the nose. They literally draw them on the walls of
like the Apple alien emoji.
Yes, but their differences did not come from outer space. They came from within the earth, which is the actual origin story of where humankind comes from in Native American and most Central and South American stories, is that humans didn't come from above, like what we consider if like God's created us or a God created us. Their versions were we rose from the earth. We came from within through tunnels and came out of tunnels onto the surface of the earth. And that's where they populated. So that's mostly like Native American up in like Comanches and the Pueblos and everything down into Aztec and Inca and all of them. They talk about these ant people.
Wow.
Yes.
It kind of sounds like the Garden of Eden.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden.
That's the story of the Anunnaki is literally the Garden of Eden. Like if you take that's the origin story of Garden of Eden. Right between the Tigris and the Euphrates. That's where the Anunnaki had their landship, and the rest were just colony cities all the way down into Egypt, down into South Africa where the gold mines were. But they landed in where we call the Garden of Eden. And that's the story of Enki and Enlil, the two creators who went to war. And it's pretty much literally the story of if you take the story of Eden in the Bible and you replace the word God and devil with Enki and Enlil, that's literally what the translations talk about with Mesopotamia, Sumer, and the Anunnaki.
Oh, wow. That's crazy. Damn, that's bananas.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining in our podcast. Thank you for staying checked in. Zach, Danny, and Mike. Follow us at yeah, no problem. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the Checked In Podcast, YouTube Checked In, Spotify, the Checked In Podcast, Twitch, the Checked In Podcast. And yeah, stay checked in with us. We appreciate y'all. Like, comment, subscribe. Let us know what you know in the comments, and hit the notification bell and to always get post updates when we post.